So God, we come before you this morning knowing we have battles we need you to fight. Church, what battles are you asking God to fight this morning? Where do you need him to fight for you?
It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded by you.
We sing together in truth.
It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded.
Sing, I'm surrounded.
It may look like I'm surrounded by you.
Yes, Lord.
It may look like I'm surrounded by you. This is how I fight my battles. 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 This is how It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you.
I'm surrounded.
It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you.
Yes, Lord, we believe.
It may look like I'm surrounded by you. This is how I fight my battles. This is how I fight my battles. This is how I fight my battles.
This is how.
This is how I fight my battles. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like you're surrounded by him.
That's right. Come on, preach, girl.
It may look like we're surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded by you.
Standing here in your presence, in a grace so relentless, I am won by perfect love, wrapped within the arms of heaven, in a peace that lasts forever, sinking deep in mercy. See, I'm wide awake, drawing close, stirred by grace, and oh, my heart is yours. All fear removed, I breathe you in, I lean into your love. Oh, 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 your love. You pursue me. I lift my head to see your glory, Lord of all. So beautiful. Here in you I find shelter, captivated by the splendor of your face. My secret place, I'm so deep is washing over me. Your face is all I see. You are my everything. Jesus Christ, you are my one desire. Lord, hear my only cry, to know you all my life. Love so deep is washing over me. Your face is all I see. You are my everything. Jesus Christ, you are my one desire. Lord, hear my only cry, to know you all my life. I'm wide awake, drawing close, stirred by grace, and all my heart is yours. All fear removed, I breathe you in, I lean into your love. Oh, 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 your love. So deep is washing over me. Your face is all I see. You are my everything. Jesus Christ, you are my one desire. Lord, hear my only cry, to know you all my life. Love so deep is washing over me. Your face is all I see. You are my everything. Jesus Christ, you are my one desire. Lord, hear my only cry, to know you all my life. Love so deep is washing over me. Your face is all I see. You are my everything. Jesus Christ, you are my one desire. Lord, hear my only cry, to know you all my life.
Amen. Thank you, praise team. I want to encourage you to take your Bible and open to the book of Psalms as we continue this series, Songs of Deliverance, today. These Psalms are so incredible, but this may be my favorite, and it's such powerful truth for our day and our time. I want you to have it before you. If you have a copy, open the Bible to Psalm 91. Let me begin, though, by asking you this question. Where do you live? I don't mean your physical address. I mean, where do you call home? Where are you centered? Where are you focused? What do you catch yourself thinking about automatically, frequently, consistently? Today, I want to take you to this incredible psalm, Psalm 91, that feels like it could have been written yesterday. The psalm is about, get this, a pandemic of terrifying proportion. Does that sound familiar? It's about a time where thousands of people are dying. It's about hard-hearted people who are doing horrific things that put other people's lives in danger. It's about nighttime terrors and daytime destruction. But it's also a story of help and hope and deliverance. It's a story, most of all, about God, about His love, about His grace. and about his invitation to any of us and all of us to move in with him, to take up residence at his place, and to live our lives in uninterrupted intimacy with the Most High God. It's all packed into this psalm. In fact, this psalm has so much. I'm going to show you in the next few minutes a quadruple conflict, a quintuple confession, and an octuple blessing. There's a lot in this thing. So I want you to see it in the Word of God, and I'll help you unpack it. I've got some handles that we can try to unpack the psalm and hang these truths on 5 hooks. So the psalm moves through a procession. It starts with a conviction that the psalmist has, and then he makes a great confession. And then after the confession, he begins to describe the incredible conflict that's swallowing up his life. He then moves to a confirmation based on his conviction about God. And then finally, though this isn't in the psalm, I want to share with you to conclude very personally from my own life how I've wrestled with this psalm this week. And I'll share with you some consternation that I felt as a pastor taking this incredible psalm and thinking about people that I'm responsible for shepherding and pastoring. So let's open up Psalm 91, in the shadow of the Almighty. And I want you to follow along as I read these incredible words inspired by God's grace in the midst of a horrific time. The psalmist writes in verse 1, "Whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. Surely He will save you from the fowler's snare and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart. You will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, nor the plague that destroys at midday. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. You will only observe with your eyes and see the punishment of the wicked. If you say, 'The Lord is my refuge,' and you make the Most High your dwelling, no harm will overtake you. No disaster will come near your tent. For He will command His angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. They will lift you up in their hands so that you will not even strike your foot against a stone. You will tread on the lion and the cobra. You will trample the great lion and the serpent. Because He loves me, says the Lord, I will rescue him. I will protect him, for he acknowledges my name. He will call on me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honor him. With long life, I will satisfy him and show him my salvation." Is there a greater psalm in the Bible for difficult times than this one? Incredible. It's almost like a protective bubble around life, it would seem, if you could live in the truth and with the God that this psalm describes. So let's walk through it. And let's see what it has to say for us and how we can experience the blessing promised in Psalm 91. We begin in verse 1 with the psalmist's conviction. That conviction was very specific. Notice what he says: "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty." Now, this is the most important part of the psalm. So whatever else you get, make sure you get this. Where you dwell determines how you rest. And again, of course, it's not talking about what neighborhood you live in, what city you live in, how well the police function there. This is a spiritual revelation. To dwell with God, to be conscious of God's presence in your life. That's the secret to rest. That's the secret to peace. That's the secret to confidence. Where you dwell determines how you rest. If you're not resting well, the problem is where you live. It's where you dwell. If you would dwell in the shelter of the Most High, you could rest in the shadow of the Almighty in the face of horrific circumstances. And isn't that a great description of where we are in the midst of this pandemic, in the midst of the turmoil over injustice and discrimination? We need to learn to dwell in the shelter of the Most High God. This beautiful picture poetically of living under the shadow of the Almighty. It's the image of shade, of course. I mean, even here, my body is casting a shadow because the light is hitting my body, and the shadow or the shade is the result of that. So what's the psalmist saying? The psalmist is saying, if you will be committed and disciplined to center your life on the presence of God, then everything that touches your life has to go through the presence of God. And God's presence will overshadow your life. Beautiful image, if we could but learn to dwell in the shelter of the Most High. I'd love for you to respond as you're worshiping with me. If you're on Facebook, just comment right now. How do you recognize the shadow of the Almighty? What is it that helps remind you, I'm not alone. God is with me. His presence is real. I feel the presence. Like we sang about earlier, it may feel like I'm surrounded, but I'm really surrounded by God, not by my problems, not by this pandemic, not by a cultural situation. I'm surrounded by God. He's overshadowing me. How do you recognize the shadow of the Almighty over your life? Just comment there as our pastors are responding. I'd love to know what helps remind you that God is with you. From this great conviction that the psalmist had, he then personalizes it with a confession in verse 2. It's a quintuple confession. Notice he says 5 times, I, my, I. Well, as athletes, Stevie, we learned that there's no I in team, but there is an I in the Most High God. And that's what he's confessing here. I will say of the Lord. He's rehearsing the truth of this conviction that he begins the psalm with. He says, I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge, my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. It's one thing to have good theology. It's another thing to engage your faith and to live by faith. It was the Apostle Paul in Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, who said, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. And the life I now live in this body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. You may have grown up in the church. You may have believed the Bible to be the Word of God your whole life, but that doesn't mean that you're living by faith, that you're personalizing this theological truth. So the psalmist begins with the conviction, with the theology. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High shall rest in the shadow of the Almighty. But then he makes it personal and he confesses, I'm going to take this to be truth for my life. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge, my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. I think you can take those confessions, that quintuple confession, and you can really cover every need a person would ever face in their lives. Maybe what you need to confess today, you need to activate your faith and trust God to be your refuge. Maybe you need healing. Maybe you're struggling with a sickness, an illness, a disease, and you need to come to God as your refuge and say, Lord, I'm putting my hope not in the doctors, not in medicine, but in you. You're the great physician. Or maybe your faith confession needs to be, Lord, I'm trusting you that you are my fortress. I need strength, God, and I'm coming to you to empower me, to lift me up, and to give me strength to face these trials that are before me. Or perhaps your faith confession ought to be like the psalmist, Lord, I'm coming to you. You are my God. That is, I'm looking to you for guidance. I want you to direct my steps. I want you to show me the way. So what about you this morning as you try to put your faith in action today, like the psalmist did here? I'd like for you just to comment and respond. What are you trusting God for most today? Is it to be your refuge, to be your fortress, or to be your God? Do you need healing? Do you need strength? Or do you most need today guidance from God? Just putting it down, just writing it out is a way to stir up your faith. God, I'm looking to you for this, and I'm going to dwell in the shelter of the Most High. Well, the part of the psalm that seems like it comes right out of the newspaper and the newscast of this week for us, the psalmist then begins to describe the conflict that he's experiencing. You certainly wouldn't have thought this the way the psalm began. It's so beautifully restful, isn't it? He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High shall rest under the shadow of the Almighty. I hope you have some serene moments like that in your life. I had one just a couple of days ago. Judy and I took off for a little bit of a getaway to Broken Bow Lake in Oklahoma. A lake I went to as a little boy. My mom was born in Broken Bow, and I think it's one of the most beautiful lakes in the country. The mountains come right down into the lake, and I'm telling you, on Friday morning, we were out on jet skis. You ought to see the First Lady on a jet ski ripping across Broken Bow Lake. And it was like it was a private lake. And we shut those jet skis off in a cove back in the mountains. And I'm telling you, you couldn't see a person. You couldn't hear a human being. All you could hear was wildlife. And it was so serene. That's what I think of when I begin Psalm 91. It's so restful. Blessed is the person who dwells in the shelter of the Most High. He'll rest in the shadow of the Almighty. But then we realize as he continues in the psalm that it's not a still, quiet moment in his life at all. In fact, all hell had broken loose. Look at this. Quadruple conflict. The deceit, the disease, the dread, the death that were all around the psalmist as he pens these beautiful words. Notice the deceit. He says, he describes the fowler's snare, the hunter who's setting the trap for the birds and catches them off guard. That's the way he felt. The disease, he refers to the deadly pestilence. Man, this wasn't just a financial squeeze. There were people dying. And then look at the dread, the deep fear that gripped the psalmist by the throat. He describes it so poignantly, the terror of night. Have you ever experienced a night terror? Awakened from a nightmare in the dark of night, sweat pouring down because you were living out this horrific experience in your imagination. Well, for the psalmist, it wasn't just a dream nightmare, it was a real nightmare. And then look at the death. I can't hardly fathom what this would be like. 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand. Can you imagine that? Being in a battle situation where literally thousands of people in your view were dying right before your eyes. That's the context and the conflict that the psalmist wrote Psalm 91 in the midst of. That's incredible. Fear is one of the great obstacles of life, one of the great barriers of a great life for God. And I just wonder where you are today. What is it that you're wrestling with? What dread, what fear, what anxiety has you by the throat, choking out the life of faith in you? It might help just for you to identify, what is it that you're really anxious about? What is it that you're really fearful of? Just comment right now. And by listing that fear, that dread, that anxiety, I'm going to ask you, as you type it in, to send it to me. I'm going to pray certainly for you, and our pastors will respond immediately to you. But I'm telling you, by just identifying it, it'll help you roll that dread, roll that anxiety, roll that fear over on the Lord. The psalmist didn't write this psalm of dwelling under the shadow of the Almighty because he was in an ideal circumstance and he didn't have a care in the world. Oh no, my friend. He wrote these incredible words when death was at his door, when dread had him around the neck. But he found the presence of God broke those shackles of dread and fear. And I'm going to challenge you to look to God and roll that fear or anxiety over on Him today. The psalm is a masterpiece. It begins with this deep conviction. It moves into a personal confession, and then he describes this quadruple conflict of the culture around him. And then the next part of the psalm is a confirmation. The psalmist begins to encourage others who might find themselves in equally pressing situations of what they could expect from God. And he lists these wonderful confirmations. First, he references the roommate that he had moved in with. He says, if you say, verse 9, the Lord is my refuge, and you make the Most High your dwelling. Remember, I told you at the outset, this is the most important truth from Psalm 91. Learning to live with God, to live in unbroken consciousness of the presence of God in your life. And if you learn to do that, if you make the Most High your dwelling, this confirmation is for you. You might be thinking, I don't know about being roommates with God. That seems a bit intimidating. Listen to this verse from the prophet Isaiah chapter 57, verse 15. This is what God said to the prophet. This is what the high and exalted one says. He who lives forever, whose name is holy. I live in a high and holy place, but also with the one who is contrite and lowly in spirit, to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive the heart of the contrite. Isn't that beautiful? That the high and holy God says, yes, I am the exalted God. I live in a high and lofty place. But I have as my roommates those who are humble and contrite in spirit, to revive their spirit and to strengthen their heart. You can be a roommate of the righteous God. If you'll make the Lord your dwelling, this confirmation is for you. Notice the next part of the confirmation. We might refer to it as the no-no claim. Look at this, verse 10. No harm will overtake you. No disaster will come near your tent. That's the no-no claim. If you learn to dwell with God, to live in unbroken consciousness of the holy presence of God in your life, nothing will tackle you from behind. Nothing will sneak up on you. No harm, no disaster. And then notice the third thing. The psalmist refers not only to God's presence, but to the angels' assistance. This is pretty awesome. Wayne was telling me this week how he took advantage of a service. He had locked the keys in his truck, and all he had to do was call OnStar, and from the satellite, boom, they just unlock it right there. Hey, this is better than OnStar, Wayne. This isn't OnStar assistance. This is angelic assistance. That if you will make the Most High your dwelling. And I want to clarify, it was Wayne's fault, not Beth's, that the keys got locked in the truck. But listen, you don't have to have OnStar. You've got heavenly stars, the angels that will be given charge over you. Look at verse 11. He will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. They will lift you up in their hands so that you will not even strike your foot against a stone. Man, that's pretty cool assistance. And then notice the supernatural empowerment. Verse 13, you will tread on the lion and the cobra. You will trample the great lion and the serpent. You say, well, that's no good to me. I don't even go to the zoo. I don't have any lions or cobras in my life. Listen, the lion and the serpent are the great biblical symbols of Satan. 1 Peter 5:8, Peter said, be on your guard. Your adversary, the devil, like a roaring lion, roams about seeking whom he may devour. And in the book of Revelation, it refers to that ancient serpent who is the devil or Satan. This is a marvelous promise, a confirmation that you will be supernaturally empowered to dominate the devil as you dwell under the shadow of the Almighty. And then, this could be a series, much less a sermon in itself. Notice next in verses 14 through 16 what I'm calling the octuple blessing. That's right, the octuple. That means 8. Listen to them. I'll just rattle them off for you. I will rescue him. I will protect him. I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him. I will honor him. I will satisfy him with long life. I will show him my salvation. The octuple blessing. If you learn to dwell in the shelter of the Most High God. How wonderful to have the blessing of God upon our lives. And what triggers that blessing? Look at verse 14. Because He loves me. Isn't that beautiful? That seems to be the secret to dwelling in the shelter of the Most High God. If you want to be a righteous roommate with God, the key to it is just loving God. Loving God more than you love yourself. Loving God more than you love your job. Loving God more than you love your kids or your grandkids. Loving God more than you love life itself. If you'll love God like that, you'll live in unbroken consciousness of the Most High God, and this October blessing will be yours. I want to ask you this morning, since all of this hinges on if you make the Most High your dwelling, I want to ask you, how are you going to make God your home this week? I want you to comment right now. If it doesn't make any difference, it doesn't make any difference. So you got to take this psalm and put it to work in your life. How are you going to make God your home base, your focus, and your center this week? I want you just to write out, this is what I'm going to do this week to practice making God my home, my focus. I want to live in the shelter of the Most High. It's an incredible confirmation that is given in Psalm 91. But I don't want to end the psalm there. I told you I was going to end the message with a personal reflection. That's the consternation part of this message. And so I want to ask the question, is Psalm 91 too good to be true? I mean, think about it. It's pretty amazing. Is it really possible to live life as described in Psalm 91? All week long, I love this psalm, and I've been living with God in this psalm. But the thing that kept coming back to my mind are people that I love, that I shepherd, that I pastor. And I kept thinking about the incredible loss and the incredible suffering and the incredible grief that they've experienced in my 30-year tenure as the pastor of this congregation. And I kept thinking, God, how are they going to feel about this psalm? How are they going to respond to this psalm that seems to suggest if you just live this way, then man, your life will be squeaky clean from struggle or hardship or devastating loss? Is that really what the psalm teaches? Then it occurred to me, do you know this is the only verse that the devil ever quoted to Jesus? Came right out of Psalm 91. Did you know that? That the devil took this great psalm and twisted it to try to get at Jesus. And it dawned on me, maybe that's what the devil will try to do today. He'll try to take these beautiful words and twist them in the heart of a hurting saint. God didn't do that for you. God didn't protect you. Look what you've gone through. This wasn't true for you. That's what he was doing to Jesus. You remember in Matthew 4, verse 6, Satan took Jesus on a ride. If you've ever wished to go to the Holy Land, man, this was a tour de luxe. He took him up to the pinnacle of the temple in Jerusalem. And from that pinnacle, Satan quoted Psalm 91 to Jesus about, hey, why don't you just jump off from here and float down among all the worshipers? And when they see you hovering down supernaturally, well, they'll know you're the Son of God. Because didn't he say that he would give his angels charge over you, that they would lift you up in their hands so that you wouldn't even hurt your foot on a stone. Tempted Jesus. But Jesus responded, Satan, get behind me. It is also written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. It reminded me of a story that I'd read long ago. It's a true story written by Elizabeth Elliot, and the title is inspired by this great psalm, The Shadow of the Almighty. One year before I was born, 5 young couples, ages 27 to 32, felt the compelling call of God to take the gospel to those who had never heard. They left their country and culture to live among the Indian people groups of the Ecuador jungle. While serving there, they heard of an unreached tribe, the Waodani, deep in the rainforest, known for their fierce and warlike customs. In fact, no one had ever lived among them or survived contact with them. Through the use of a small bush plane, the missionaries located the Waodani and over several weeks dropped presents to the tribe in an attempt to build trust and friendship. Their passion was to take the gospel to those who had never heard it. In January of 1956, Nate Saint, the missionary aviation pilot, made multiple trips to deliver Pete Fleming, Jim Elliott, Ed McCulley, and Roger Udarian and their supplies to a sandy bend in the Curaray River the missionaries had dubbed Palm Beach. The 5 young missionaries set up base camp on the river and made successful contact with 3 of the Waodani tribe, even taking one of them up in the plane and flying low over the tribal encampment for the Indians to see their comrade safe and happy on board. But a few days later, all 5 of the missionaries were speared to death by a group of Waodani warriors. This 4-minute clip you will see is of the pilot's son, Steve Saint, who was 5 years old when his father was killed by the Waodani. Take a look at this.
My dad was killed when I was just a little boy, and it was with 4 of his friends, and it was a really violent killing. And people ask me all the time, how I could forgive the people that killed my dad, including grandfather Minkai, who I think was the one who finally did kill my dad. But, I'm sure that they don't understand the perspective from which I saw it all. My dad and his 4 friends, Roger, Pete, Ed, and Jim, knew that they were risking their lives to try to contact this violent group that had never had friendly contact with the outside world. And then when it came right down to them being attacked, they had guns and they could have defended themselves, but they preferred to die rather than kill, even in self-defense. My aunt was living with a young girl from the Waodani tribe who had fled. My mom went on praying for the Waodani, and then Aunt Rachel went back in to live with these people for the very first time as outsiders. And my aunt knew that there was a risk, and I knew that there was a risk that she would be killed too. Well, by the time a year and a half later, when I got to go in and live with Aunt Rachel with these people who'd killed my dad, that isn't the way I saw them at all. I saw them as being the most special people in the whole world. I mean, why else would my dad have been willing to die for them, my mom go on praying for them, and my aunt risk her life for them? People think it's so amazing that I would forgive Minkai, but in their culture, because he killed my family, it was my right and my responsibility when I grew up to kill him or his family. But when I went in to live in the jungles, I was just 8 or 9. And I didn't have any of the skills that I needed to live in the jungles. And Minkai, I went to my Aunt Rachel, and he said, "What's wrong with Steve?" They call me Bobette down there. "What's wrong with Bobette? He doesn't know how to make poison for his darts, he can't make darts, he doesn't know how to use a blowgun, he can't track animals." He said, "He doesn't know anything." He said, "Who's going to teach him how to live?" And my aunt said, "You having speared his father, who do you say should teach him to live?" And he came back and he said, "Me having speared his father, now I say I myself will teach him to live." But you know, in doing that, because he had started walking a new trail, he had no idea. I was just a little boy. He had no idea whether I was going to walk God's trail or whether I would use the skills that he was teaching me to come back and kill him. But he forgave me what he assumed I would grow up to do because he had begun walking this new trail. So really, if you look at it in the reality in which it took place, the forgiveness that he was willing to believe that I had given up my vendetta against him, and then gave me the skills that I would need to carry it out if I didn't give it up, his was maybe the greater forgiveness than mine. When I was a teenager, my sister decided that she wanted to be baptized, and my mom said, "Since you don't have a father of your own who's living, why don't you choose somebody who's had a positive spiritual impact in your life, and I'll ask him to baptize you." Well, Kathy immediately chose Chemo, one of the men who had killed my dad and Roger and Pete and Ed and Jim. And I thought, you know, look at these men here, Chemo and Dewey and Minkai. They're the same men who were here at this very place and killed my dad. And now here they are. They're spiritual leaders in our lives. And I realized if we let God write the story, He doesn't always promise that all the chapters will be easy, but He does promise that in the last chapter, He will make sense of all the other things that have happened in our life, even though some of them are terribly painful. And I'm very, very thankful that He has.
This chapter, Psalm 91, is not the last chapter. And whatever difficulties and hardships and grief and loss you've experienced, it's not the last chapter. This is a true story, not just about those missionaries and Steve Saint, the son who grows up in the tribe that took his father's life. It's a true story of Psalm 91 that you can learn to live in unbroken consciousness of the Most High God, and that His overshadowing presence of your life will intercept every circumstance of your experience, not to keep you from loss or grief or hardship, but to make sure that He writes the last chapter. Elizabeth Elliot, who wrote The Shadow of the Almighty, wrote an epilogue 40 years after the death of her husband, Jim Elliot, and the 4 other missionaries attempting to reach the Waodani people with the gospel. And she writes, "God is God. If He is God, He is worthy of my worship and my service. I will find rest nowhere but in His will. And that will is infinitely, immeasurably, unspeakably beyond my largest notions of what He is up to. For us widows," she writes, "the question as to why the men who had trusted God to be both shield and defender should be allowed to be speared to death was not one that could be smoothly or finally answered. God did not answer Job's questions either. I believe with all my heart that God's story has a happy ending, but not yet, not necessarily yet. It takes faith to hold on to that truth in the face of the great burden of experience, which sometimes seems to prove otherwise. My friend, I know some of you are hurting deeply. It's hard for you to fathom that you could live out the promises of Psalm 91 because of your wounds, because of your loss, because of your grief. You think, how could that be true for me? But what I want to remind you of today is that Psalm 91 is just part of a great love letter from God to you. Don't misread the letter. It doesn't mean that you can measure the love of God by the absence of conflict or hurt or loss in your life. But it does mean that God is for you, that He is with you. It does mean that you can find a home in the heart of God. And if you will learn to snuggle up to Him, to live under the shadow of the Almighty, even your griefs, even your tears, even your scars will be redeemed in time and for eternity. Do you need a new home? God's still advertising for a roommate. Moses said it best in Psalm 90, the very next psalm, verse 1. Lord, he wrote, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. That's my desire for you, and that's God's desire. He wants you as a roommate. He wants you to move in with Him. He wants you to surrender your life to Him today. And I'm going to ask you to do that right now. You may have known about God all your life, but if you've never stepped through that threshold to say, Lord, I'm giving my life to you. I need you to forgive my sins, and I invite you to come into my life. Would you pray that prayer right now? The Bible promises whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And if you have taken that step, don't keep it a secret. You need a pastor. You need a shepherd. You need someone that can help you grow. I want to be that shepherd for you. If you'll just write me, scott@meadowsbaptist.org. Not only will I pray over you, I'll contact you. I'll help you to get started in this new life of faith, to learn to live in unbroken consciousness of the presence of God in your life. And for those of you who've already taken that step to receive Christ, I want to remind you, it's different from just praying a prayer so you go to heaven, to learn every day to dwell in the shelter of the Most High God. That's a discipline. That's a choice. That takes practice. But would you begin today and just pray this prayer with me? Lord, from this day forward, I want you to be my home. I want to learn to dwell in unbroken communion and fellowship with you. The Holy Spirit will teach you how. Now, one last thing I want you to do. I want everybody that's engaged online with me right now, I want you to go to our website, meadowsbaptist.org/engage. This is for every person that's participating in this worship service. I want you to go to that engage card, and these are new every week. This was designed for today, for this message, for this moment with you. And I want you to go to that meadowsbaptist.org/engage, and I want you to put in words. Think about it, pray about it, and then I want you to put in words how you're going to practice resting under the shadow of the Almighty this week. It could be the most important thing you've done in months, maybe your whole life, to set a path this week. I'm going to live with God. I'm going to stay focused on God. Well, it's been great to worship with you. I want you to connect with us all week long with our ministry programming. And before we leave and sing over you, I want to leave you this great blessing. It's a benediction that I've written out from Psalm 91, and it's for you. I want to pronounce this blessing over you and let it just swallow you up with the love and the grace and the presence of God. This is my gift for you. May the place you call home always be the heart of God. And may you always be conscious of God's presence in your life. May the sovereign grace of God always be your refuge and your fortress. May the angels of God attend to your way. And may your hardest times become your deepest treasures of intimacy with the Almighty.